you suffer as a Stoic when you try to skip to the end result. The Stoics pursue truth, and they have arguments for why only good character is good and vice is bad, and why you shouldn't feel negative emotions. They have complex arguments for these, but this requires you to study.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Monteveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Stoicism and toxic positivity or unrealistic optimism. Some of the issues that come up with, interacting with other people, being Stoic, but also there are also these questions about, as a Stoic, how do you think about issues like toxic positivity, harmful optimism, unrealistic expectations, and so on.
Yeah, and I wanted to do this episode for two reasons. First, I think there's a misconception among non-Stoics that's becoming Stoic at its worst could be toxic positivity or could be excuse for being toxically positive. And we'll talk about what that means, whether or not we think that's a relevant even concept, toxic positivity. But it is a way to criticize the project of Stoicism. So toxic positivity at its worst, maybe even harmful optimism, even if you're being more charitable, at least just a kind of blind ignorance to the bad things in the world at your own expense. And first I want to address that and show why Stoicism is not that and the difference between Stoicism and toxic positivity. And the second reason I want to talk about this is I think there's also, even though Stoicism is not those things, there is a risk that Stoicism incorrectly practiced can lead to, harmful side effects, can become toxic positivity or a kind of unrealistic optimism. And so by pulling those concepts apart and clarifying where Stoicism ends and those other things begin, we can, help people, myself included, clarify and avoid those kind of pitfalls that I think are common.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have those two prongs. There's a misconception on behalf of non-Stoics, perhaps, and then also the real risk that Stoics might, in some ways, support that misconception by their own practice. That's similar to the charge that Stoicism is just about, suppressing feelings or just about resilience. That lowercase Stoic. There's also, you have that same issue, misconception on behalf of non-Stoics, where they see Stoicism as just this limited project, but also the risk behalf of Stoics themselves of either overrating resiliency, or I suppose perhaps sometimes people might, though this is less common, do the opposite, underrate resiliency as a way to respond to non-Stoics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And then there's this thing, because I think just to take a step further, there's this idea of, well, it gets conflated with the small s Stoicism, which is this idea of just, not feeling any negative emotions and things like this. And then I think that the unrealistic optimism or toxic positivity are then well, what's wrong with being a small s Stoic? Well, it leads to these things that are bad things. And then, so that's why we don't want to be a small s Stoic. Not only is a small s Stoic wrong or not accurate, not the same thing as the philosophy, the robust philosophy of Stoicism, but it can lead to these consequences. So yeah, as you said, two prongs of attack, and we'll see how we go. And I know that you and I, Kelly, we were talking about this a bit before the episode. I wouldn't say we necessarily disagree about this, but this is still something we're figuring out and actively discussing. So maybe we'll debate a bit of this as we go as well.
Nice. Yeah, we shall have some debate detours. We'll see.
Yeah, pull ourselves back on track if we have to. Cool. So for the episode, we're going to talk about what is toxic positivity and unrealistic optimism, and what is the differences between Stoicism and those things, and then talk a bit about the genuine risks of Stoics of falling into those pitfalls, as we said. So to kick things off, what is toxic positivity and what is unrealistic optimism? I'm not a psychologist, and these are just, these are ways of thinking about phenomenon we see in people, or ways that people can relate to resiliency and their emotions. And so I've put together a little definition. I think that toxic positivity, if we're going to use it meaningfully, is when you don't acknowledge negative emotions or the possibility of poor outcomes, either for yourself or for others. And this is closely related to this idea of unrealistic optimism, but I think they're worth pulling apart. And for me, Harmful optimism is when you don't acknowledge the possibility of negative emotions or poor outcomes, and it harms yourself. It's kind of an unrealistic, unpragmatic worldview that doesn't lead, you don't prepare yourself for negative situations. You don't expect them. You don't see them coming. And then you're harming yourself. And then I would say toxic positivity is when you go a step further and you actually start harming other people. So you start forcing other people into that box about, well, no, you're not allowed either to feel negative things, or you're not allowed to bring up bad emotions, or the fact that you think something is a terrible thing has happened because that's because I'm this optimistic person. Now you're pushing back against that, so I'm going to force you also to be in that box of optimism, and you start harming other people or letting them down in the way that you're supposed to support them. So that's the distinction. I mean, the closely related for me, I think that one is just when it starts to affect others. That's toxic positivity. And then unrealistic optimism is just whenever you're overly optimistic, and that's kind of harming yourself because you're not seeing the world as it is. Any thoughts on those definitions?
Yeah. So does it? The main difference just has to do with unrealistic optimism holds you back, toxic positivity holds you back, but also it has this social aspect where you are sharing, your thought patterns essentially with others, either shaming them, causing them to be positive in a way that is unrealistic, unhealthy, not accurate, not helpful.
Yeah, that's accurate.
That's the core of it.
That's what I'm
That's
working with. I'm totally open to changing these, but I'm trying to call across these kind of two different aspects. One is I guess a personal thing that harms yourself, and the other is something that becomes almost an ethical problem. You almost start letting other people down and harming your relationships in that social way. Yeah, that's the what I'm working with. But um, yeah, flexible to changing those. But I think that's a useful distinction.
nice. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go through some of those, some of these examples you have then here and draw that
Yeah.
out.
So with these definitions that I've made up, I think that unrealistic optimism, it's maladaptive optimism that just harms you. It's just an unrealistic perspective of the world. And it's not directed towards other people, as we said. So, a really famous example of this is Admiral Stockdale's story on who broke first, who suffered the most in the prisoner of war camp. Those that aren't familiar with Admiral Stockdale, he was a member of the U.S. military, spent I think around 7 years in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam, and he talked about he was there with other Americans, and he spoke about who was able to persevere, who was able to be resilient in this really terrible, terrible situation, an example of kind of most robust resiliency. And he actually pointed out that the people who were not resilient were the optimists. And this is his quote: the people who broke first, they were the optimists. They were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is an example of how, when you're setting yourself up with these expectations, you think you're empowering yourself because you're being optimistic. You think you're giving yourself energy, but you're actually setting yourself up for failure. I think of this, another way to think of unrealistic optimism, I think is maybe the opposite of the practice of memento mori or premeditatio malorum. So those are those Stoic exercises. Memento mori is to remember death. Premeditatio malorum is just to consider bad things before they happen, contemplate what it would be like if the bad thing happened. So, in the Stockdale example, premeditatio malorum is to say, consider what it would be like if you didn't get out at Thanksgiving. What would you do? How would you handle that? What if you weren't out by Christmas? What if you weren't out by
Mm-hmm.
next Christmas? And so you're contemplating that, you're building your resiliency for that by thinking about it. And we can think of unrealistic optimism as the person who not only doesn't do that, but almost does the opposite, almost feeds themselves these hopes and these dreams without a reason to think about them. Another example of this, we can think about it in Epictetus. This is a story I talk about a lot, but when he talks to that father who ran away from home when his daughter was sick because he couldn't handle the stress, basically, of the possibility of his daughter passing away. And there's a lot of ways we can talk about that story, but one part of that story, I think, is somebody who just was not prepared or resilient to, or had not sufficiently considered the possibility of a terrible thing happening to their daughter, or, burying a child before, uh, as a parent, just even just that
Hmm.
possibility, and so wasn't prepared for it, wasn't resilient to it. So that's what I have in mind as some examples of that's what makes the optimism harmful. Is it makes you kind of weak and not resilient when the bad things do come.
Yeah, that story is a good example because that's a nice case, I think, of where unrealistic optimism can go wrong, or like what's the outcome of unrealistic optimism? You can imagine the father just didn't have, as you said, in mind the possibility that his daughter would become seriously sick and hadn't asked himself what he would do in such a situation, what he ought to do.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think you raise a good point there because I think the often the criticism of this criticism, the pushback from the optimists would be like, well, what's the harm? Makes me feel good. What's the problem? And so, as you said, yeah, this is one of the problems, right?
yeah, yeah. I think unrealistic optimism is a really useful notion and something that is essentially Stoic. As I think the example from Stockdale, famous Stoic, is also a good one. Perhaps another way to get at it is in the Stoic view, it's assuming that something is going to happen in reality, and often something that you've seriously invested your well-being in, that
Mm,
is external to you, or something positive is going to happen, or that something negative is not going to happen.
yeah,
So I suppose that's how the way the Stoic would see it is you have this expectation of reality that's unwarranted, and you've sort of invested yourself in that outcome. So it's, I think, the classic mistake the Stoics accuse us of making is not being robust to fortune, because we are in many real senses unrealistically optimistic.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's a really great way of putting it because it's not unrealistic optimism. Trying to think of not of a silly example, but if you flip a coin and you think the coin is going to come up heads, it's not unrealistic optimism. It comes up tails. You were wrong, but who cares? You didn't invest yourself in that. But when you think, oh well, it's going to be sunny next week and I'm going to be able to have a picnic. There's no point. You've ascribed your well-being or put your well-being into that outcome, and you have no guarantee of that outcome. It's outside of your control. And so you've made yourself vulnerable to fortune. That's kind of a silly example, but we can do, and then the more intense you go. And I think what you called attention to also was this idea that unrealistic optimism is no different than unrealistic pessimism. It's like really putting your well-being in something outside of your control. And whether
Mm-hmm.
that's like, oh well, I'm going to fail anyway, so who cares? Why should I try? I shouldn't apply for that job. I shouldn't talk to that person because they're not going to like me anyway. That kind of unrealistic pessimism would be the same way. And unrealistic optimism is a flip. And I think the unrealistic optimism can feel good in the moment, feel a lot better than the pessimism in the moment, but it brings with it the same amount of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's a great point. I think they're forms of the same mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And then moving from that to toxic positivity. Again, these are my definitions. There's things for us to talk about in relation to Stoicism. I think toxic positivity is it's unrealistic optimism that harms others, or if we want to use Stoic language, your ability to fulfill your role. So, toxically positive person, they'll never admit that when something's wrong. They'll shame themselves for feeling negative emotions and other people, and then they'll have little sympathy or time for the negative emotions of others in a way that's bad for the people around them. So, I brought up some examples. So, imagine a boss who's not receptive to negative feedback or not able to have candid discussions of what's wrong with the company. A parent who's unable to acknowledge or engage with the negative emotions of their children, and so they're not able to parent well. A friend who's unable or unwilling to discuss negative situations, only ever pointing out that things happen for a reason. That friend you come to for advice or sympathy, and then they're just like, well, get over it. It's not really that big of a deal. I think what all these examples have in common from a Stoic perspective is that this unrealistic optimism, this unwillingness to engage with an aspect of human existence and an aspect of human life is actually making them unable to fulfill their roles, making them kind of having almost an ethical failure in that sense and harming the people around them and themselves.
Nice. Yeah. So again, the central failure is, or the central part of this concept is that it's social, and it's a kind of optimism that treats others wrongly.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, as you say, whether that's not responding to the contents of their negative feelings, negative judgments, or perhaps even it's not creating. So I think sometimes people talk about creating a culture or a way of being where you're not even responding to others. You're almost exuding a kind of positivity that is fragile in a way that um, doesn't allow for any amounts of sadness, tragedy. Always seeing that silver lining, even when it's unhelpful to do so, or even if when there may not be one at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that exuding energy that's fragile is, and I think we've all experienced that either in that form or a different form. Somebody who you're like, wow, you're not a person that I can really talk to about these kind of things, or like you're not, this is not helpful even though you think it is. I think we've all kind of experienced that kind of interaction, and we don't need to pathologize people, but we can all kind of act this way in some points. Um, we've all either been like this or experienced this. Um, and so what I wanted to call attention to is that there seems to be a lot of similarities then between Stoicism and unrealistic optimism or toxic positivity, at least on the
Yeah.
surface.
Well, should we take our first detour here and
Yeah,
see?
sure.
I want to get maybe it'll nicely move into what you have for similarities and differences. But I probably should have said this up front, but I have a view on toxic positivity, and it's not a concept that plays any role, I think, in my own thought when I'm thinking about my own actions or thoughts with regard to others or myself, or thinking about others. Are they acting in a way that's exuding toxic positivity? Um, and we'll see if this changes my mind. I should say that I think the term is pointing at something real, but some of my main objections or concerns with this term is the thought that it's relatively new. I think it was first used in 2010 or so, took off at 2020. And I think the people or cultures who tend to use it tend to both use it in a wide range of ways. It's somewhat vague in a way. I think unrealistic optimism is a very precise term. Toxic positivity is not. And it's often associated with placing too much emphasis on feelings. The people who accuse others of being toxically positive, I think, are often neurotic or just prefer neurotic cultures, which isn't so much of a criticism. But the use of the word toxic, I think, does indicate that someone is acting wrongly, not fulfilling their roles in a way that may often be misguided. It may just be different preferences on, how much neuroses do you allow in your culture and so on. I think there's a lot there, but if I try to boil those different concerns, first, there's a kind of vagueness to the term that we're going to tease out in this conversation. And the fact that I think it's associated with a culture that tends to place too much emphasis on feelings and tends to be more neurotic than other cultures.
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with the cultural association. So this is something that I've although I feel comfortable making a podcast on it, but I'm not, but I'm not super familiar with the cultural association. For me, what I've seen, and the brief research I did before this, I do think it calls out something, and there's something we can there's some aspect of the world that I want to put a box on that I've just defined as those things, right? Which is like
Mm-hmm.
unrealistic optimism that's harmful to people around you. And the way that I'm taking what you're saying, Caleb, is like, do we want to take that? Do we want to co-opt this term then, toxic positivity, because it comes with a certain cultural baggage, and that cultural baggage you're saying is it's tend to be, I don't want to necessarily use the term weaponized, but the idea is it can be used actually too far in the other way of like, I can feel whatever I want to feel. You can't, you know, you can't say I'm feeling something wrong. You can't put a box around me, or tell me to feel differently or not feel this negative thing. And then the people that are using the term toxic positivity are being anti-stoic in a way, because what stoicism is looking to do is it's looking to, keep healthy emotions, but call out and identify unhealthy emotions, passions, and rightly, maybe if not shame, maybe in some cases shame. Epictetus certainly shames his students,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, maybe shame carefully and intentionally, and in other cases criticize or point out the faults with harmful emotions. And then if somebody uses, well, you're being toxically positive as a catch-all to justify whatever they're feeling, that's not really healthy either. Um, that's the criticism. Is there another term you would use? Would you still just say, would you just call all of this unrealistic optimism then, and just say, let's throw toxic positivity altogether because it comes with that baggage?
Yeah, well, let's see. Perhaps I don't have a good term for some of these examples. Some of your examples where the the friend's unwilling to discuss some negative situation. Sometimes that's because the friend is being unrealistically optimistic. They say, "Oh, this happened." You try to explain a given situation, and they'll say it'll turn out for the best, whatever it is, and come up with some fancy story that makes things turn out the best. That's totally unrealistic, totally unhelpful. That's unrealistic optimism in action. There is a different kind of
Yeah.
mistake though, which is like your boss example, where the boss is not receptive to negative feedback, or they are scared, not willing to have hard conversations about what's wrong with a given employee or what's wrong with the company's strategy. That's a kind of different. Those might not be unrealistic optimism. There's a kind of, in the first one, maybe some issues with ego, being too personally fragile, whatever it is. In the second one, a kind of unwillingness to look at certain parts of reality or deal with certain parts of
Yeah,
reality.
and I think that's what carves out the difference between toxic positivity. Again, in my own mind here, between toxic positivity and unrealistic optimism, is toxic positivity almost, there's almost a kind of anger that can come with it, or a kind of, as you said, a fragility. Like, we can't even bring these things up. Like, don't even mention the possibility of these things, or I'm offended you would even say that, as opposed to, the unrealistic optimist, where it's like, what happens if you fail, and they're like, I won't fail, and they're kind of secure, but they're like inaccurate, right? Like, they're they don't have a
Mhm.
reason to make that claim, so they're unrealistic, but there's a security there. Where I find the toxicity can sometimes come from, whatever that means, just means kind of unhealthy behavior can come from that fragility, and I think those are different experiences.
Yeah, you're right. I think if you were to associate it with other vices, sometimes you can see pride
Yeah, totally.
as a vice that's associated with this. An example where someone doesn't take any feedback or what have you. I think there's probably another vice though, which is just not, and it's especially important that it's social. In a social sphere, is not being, it's almost just like, I think, a kind of cowardice, not being willing to have difficult encounters with others, being too agreeable, or using positivity to avoid, you know, conflict in a way that's, too conflict averse.
Yeah, and then conflict averse either in being kind of meek or agreeable, but there can also be conflict averse in, you can be conflict averse but not agreeable, which is to say you kind of dominate things with the positivity too.
Sure,
Um,
sure, yeah,
and then
that's a
you're
good point.
you're averse to like genuine conflict, so you're averse to not being in a position of power,
Mhm.
which comes from that criticism.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think there are different kinds of vices here. So to that extent, the term toxic positivity does point at something real. But I would still, when I'm thinking about these sorts of situations, I would try to see, is this a situation that involves pride, overbearing
Hmm.
positivity, or cowardice? And I think that that's a little bit, that's more precise, and it doesn't have this issue of a kind of, I think, neurotic inflexibility that you sometimes see, or at least that I sometimes see when the term, toxic positivity is thrown around.
Yeah. Cool. So maybe to summarize, or what I hear you saying is this, let's be specific. Maybe toxic positivity can be like an umbrella term, but there's different ways it can manifest. There's different reasons it can manifest. And, maybe you can use that term, but call it out. Like if it's an issue of pride, call it pride. If it's an issue of cowardice, call it cowardice. Be clear on what the kind of the issue is that's leading to this inability to look at the hard stuff or the bad stuff in the face.
Yeah, yeah. I wouldn't use the term, but I think we could go. We could keep on going and disagreements about like when you use terms, when you don't. But I think that's a good gloss.
Yeah, cool. So whether or not we want to call it toxic positivity or what, we're calling out something in the world, right? We're calling out a feature of behavior, and something that people rightly want to avoid, and other people might call you as you start to practice stoicism,
Yeah.
or as you continue to practice stoicism. And it's like, well, how do you respond to that then? You know, these people incorrectly using a term. Um, so, and to be fair, I guess it's a be charitable. There's a reason people would say this. So on the surface, there seems to be a lot in common with unrealistic optimism or toxic positivity and stoicism. And these are the similarities. First, stoicism will not consider or does not consider many situations as being bad and harmful, even when they seem that way to other people, or they are considered bad and harmful in traditional, society, social expectations, including things like losing your job, getting sick, even as you at extremes like a death in the family. If you're, a sage, you're looking at that
Mhm.
situation differently. If somebody gets fired and you're like, well, vice is the only real bad. Sorry, can't help you here. You're bumping up against social expectations, definitely. Um, two, Stoics want to eliminate passions or any negative emotion based on incorrect beliefs. So Stoics don't have that kind of non-judgmental acceptance of negative emotions. They're comfortable judging some negative emotions, passions, ones based on incorrect beliefs, as being false, um, harmful to the individual. So and not needing kind of reassurance or validation, right? It's like I shouldn't validate you if you're doing something bad, right? The third similarity, so Stoics, especially new practicing Stoics, they often have trouble immediately sympathizing with the passionate responses of other people. Um, which is to say that you can come off harsh to other people, especially someone like, oh, this just happened to me. Can you believe it? And there's almost a
Mhm.
kind of routine they want you to play into where they want you to kind of emote or mirror their feelings. And if you start not doing that, people will be like, well, what's wrong with this person? What's going on here? And the fourth similarity is that Stoics, they will sometimes use shame as a motivating factor, and rightly so. And so, not only will they not feed into inappropriate grief or some passions, but they might actually actively shame you if you're feeling things like anger, or jealousy or something like this, as being like, that's a not only is that an unhealthy, unproductive emotion, it's based on kind of a nasty belief. And I'm going to call you out for that. I'm not just going to feed into it.
Mhm.
Um, so I think if you're not a practicing Stoic, the same way I don't know much about cars. Two cars look the same to me. If I'm not a practicing, I can't tell the difference between a Mercedes and a Porsche. And if you're not a practicing Stoic, you encounter a Stoic who doesn't validate you because you're angry, and a toxically positive person who doesn't validate you when you're angry. They can kind of seem the same. They come off the same. Anything to say on those similarities? But I don't think they're the same, and I want to call out the differences. But anything to say on the similarities before we move on to the differences?
Well, yeah, I think you can see why someone would accuse a Stoic of being toxically positive, and in some cases, it's they're going to be correct, and others they might be wrong. So it's interesting to think about, how would you respond to that accusation, or at least perhaps even that possibility in behavior. I think, yeah. And we should get into that for sure.
Yeah. So here are the tools. If someone accuses you, you can rattle off these philosophical arguments and
Yeah.
and persuade them like a Socratic dialogue, and they'll be like, of course, Michael. How could I not see?" And everything will be great. If only philosophy worked this way. Um, so what's the difference? They seem the same at a high level, and in some ways the actual behavior will be the same, but the grounding behind the behavior, the reasoning for the behavior is not. The reasoning you're shaming the angry person is not. So what's the difference here? Well, the first difference is that the Stoics seek truth. So they're not willfully ignorant. They seek truth. So an unrealistic optimist, I could say there's somebody who is not seeking truth. They're probably seeking a feeling. They want to not be sad. They want to not be anxious. They want to not be stressed. And so they adopt blindly whatever perspective will make them feel that way. The prisoner of war wants to feel hope. And so they adopt the view that will make them in the moment feel hope, even if it's long term, not the best thing for their emotional well being. And that's not judgmental. I mean, I think obviously it's understandable why the person would want that, but that's still the case of putting a feeling above the truth. And so the Stoics do admit, and this is sometimes missed, because they say things like virtue or vice is the only bad. But the Stoics will admit that some things are worse than others. They use the term disprefer to difference, and we have an episode on indifference. So they don't use the term bad because they want to save that for a special category of bad things, which is when you a bad character. But they do have this term disprefer indifference, which is to say, my life can go perfectly well if this happens, but I don't want this to happen. It's better off if it doesn't happen. And so there is in the Stoic values a kind of complexity about the way things are going. Some things are worse than others. Some things you prefer over others. There's this line by Seneca, let not the eyes be dry when we have lost a friend, nor let them overflow. We may weep, but we must not wail. And that's Seneca from his Moral Letters, letter 63. So you can cry, you can have wet eyes, but you should not wail. And that's that idea of, there's this nuance to the world. There's things we would prefer not happen. There are things that are some situations that are worse than others in a sense, but nothing that is so terrible to destroy us. And all this is to say that the Stoic is happier than other people because they genuinely think the world is a better place than most other people think it is. They think that there's some dispreferred things, but there's a lot less bad things than people think there are. And when they see it that way, they just try to align their feelings with that reality. And when they do that, they have a more robust, more resilient, happier emotional life than other people do. Not because they're trying to think the way that will make them feel good, but just because when they think about the world, they will feel good because they recognize that things are not as bad as other people think they are, even though there's things that are less preferable than others, and there's some situations that are you try to avoid if you have to. And that's the difference between the harmful optimist or the unrealistic optimist who tries to see the world in the way that will make them feel the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a crucial point. And you certainly can see maybe Epictetus as most like this, the most has the most toxic optimism of any of the three, where I think there's this sense that things are going to turn out for the best. Mentions terrible events. So Seneca has a little bit of this too. Seneca's maybe somewhat inconsistent here. Mentions sages facing terrible events unscathed, but at the same time, I think it's important to remember that this fundamental Stoic optimism is that whatever situation you are in, happiness is possible. Whatever life you've been given, happiness is possible. But that's consistent with recognizing a lot of vice, a lot of dispreferred indifference in the world. You can still recognize that there is tragedy in the world, and no
Yeah.
one is going to emerge unscathed. The fundamental Stoic optimism is that happiness is still possible, but that shouldn't come at the expense of downplaying these obstacles we face.
Yeah, and that connects to the second point, which is just that I think the Stoic view of emotions is a lot more complex than the unrealistic optimistic view of emotions. Um, so the second difference I would say is that the Stoics view emotions as a craft. They're not a it's not a binary because the truth is complex. So the emotions are complex because the truth is complex, and we're always trying to correctly judge the truth. We're always trying to understand the world as it is, and that's a craft and a skill, kind of an intellectual skill that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the Stoics, a healthy emotional life, it's like being a skilled athlete or a craftsman. It's a skill you develop over time, and it requires a keen sense for the nuance of each situation. Where you think of that like an artist or an athlete or a skilled carpenter. Unrealistic optimism, it's like me following the IKEA instructions. It's the furthest thing from being a skilled carpenter. It's very black and white. It is happy feelings are good, bad feelings are bad. So, think whatever you need to get happy feelings. Don't think whatever produces bad feelings. That's unrealistic optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And that is these may look the same. If an unrealistic optimist was like, well, I'm not worried about losing my job, and a Stoic was like, I'm not worried about losing my job, they might say the same thing in the moment, but somebody came to that conclusion as a skilled, as a skilled practitioner of life, of the craft of life, who has understood the nuance of the situation and the reality of the world. And the other person has followed the step by step and the 3-step instructions, where it's like, well, if I'm worried about losing my job, I'll feel bad, so I will not do that. And that's not a complex, nuanced position that has like this deep theoretical background that Stoicism does. You can't teach the nuance of soccer in a day, or painting, or being a good writer, or being a good carpenter. You can't teach that in a day. And then the harmful optimist is like that person who's taken one lesson and thinks they understand how to do something. They've taken one carpentry lesson, and they think they can build a house. Um, they try to jump straight to the outcome without building the skill or the craft that it takes to get there. They want to be like the Stoic, but they haven't put in that work that the Stoic does to make sure we can get that outcome in the right way. And there's no easy way around that, right? It just takes work.
Yeah, I think that's right. Another way to put that is emotions are complex because it's exceptionally difficult to come to knowledge. Like in a way, the truth is simple. It's something, a given proposition is just true or false. But in any given situation, there are, you know, thousands of different propositions at play. You just there are different ways of cutting out the world. So you could increase that or decrease that number as you choose. But the main point is there are so many different things at play. What you decide to judge, assent to, is an exceptionally complex matter. Um, and then, how you form that judgment on each of those propositions is a difficult matter and requires training in and of itself. I think to try and make that more concrete, we've, I think, been in discussions with people who are, say, better at arguing or better at debating, but clearly wrong. And the kind of mistakes those people might make is maybe focusing on the wrong propositions. That's one kind of mistake. And I think there's a kind of perhaps maybe defensiveness that you might see people take when others around them are expressing negative emotions, a kind of downplaying of that negativity because they don't want that negativity to enter into their being. And that defensiveness just might immediately pick on the thing that's obviously false about what they said and miss some of the deeper truths that might be expressed, uh, or miss what the person's really trying to say.
Yeah, I like that idea. The idea of it's like sophistry, right? Like the person who's the good arguer, but not but wrong. It's like the person who's saying the things that they you know almost like faking it till they make it. They go like, well, I'm this is fine, this isn't bugging me, I'm happy. right? And you're missing the nuance of the situation. You're skipping a step, and so you look like you have the outcome, but it's not built on the foundation. And to push the carpentry example further, I guess that's the fragility we were talking about earlier. Your house will fall down. It might look the same if it's made poorly, but the skilled carpenter will make one that can stand up to an earthquake or whatever you want to call it. And that's the fragility you have in those kind of conversations with someone who's unrealistically optimistic versus someone who's maybe has a stoic perspective. They're secure in their optimism. They're confident in their optimism, where the unrealistic optimistic person or the toxically positive person can be fragile because they're not as secure.
Yeah, I think the skill metaphor is key. I think if you want to talk, another kind of a example perhaps is in most skills, like take martial arts. If you're at a low level, there are certain kinds of mistakes your partner might make, and you might just punish them for making a dumb mistake and give them a kind of advice. In a way, you're sort of responding. You're taking like the bad stoic response. In a way, you do that. They made a dumb mistake. You're saying do this sort of thing. Obviously, whereas someone with more experience, like Michael, would say, you can actually play with that kind of mistake and suit that to your style, or at the very least,
Ooh.
come up with a better explanation for the person about, why that's a mistake,
So yeah,
what sorts of small tweaks they can take towards fixing it.
as soon as you start using martial arts metaphors, it clicks for me. It starts making more sense. So this is the idea, like, you come up, so you're sad, right? This is, and you're grieving something that shouldn't be somebody else insulted you and it's making you upset. And so the toxically positive person, as the beginner, they pretend like they're good, but they're just like, no, that's wrong. Don't feel that way. That's a bad way to feel. And then the more, and they're just shutting down your technique mistake, right? But the more advanced person, the stoic, can be like, okay, why are you feeling that way? What is that saying about your values? Oh, okay, you care what other people think. Well, do you care what this person thinks? Or do you care what your friends think? Well, I care what my friends think. Okay, was this person your friend? No. Okay, so maybe you shouldn't care about what they think as much as you care what I think. And I don't think that insult was true. You can start working through, you can start playing a bit of technique with them and helping them, work through their own emotions. And that's a kind of therapy or advice that's still totally true to Stoicism. You're not betraying Stoicism by doing that. Um, but as you said, you're not shutting down immediately because you're not very skilled. So when you see a mistake, you just shut it down. We're
Yeah,
getting at?
absolutely. No, I think that's right. And I think the skilled person remembers their role,
Cool.
and yeah, and they think about how can I be excellent in my role in this situation, and perhaps less about how can I, you know, immediately stop this person from making a mistake or being obnoxious or what have you.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, that connects with the last difference that I wanted to talk about. And that, they're talking to friend example. And that's the difference is that Stoics um, do and can sympathize with others in a way that I think unrealistic optimists, or at least or certainly toxically positive people, would have trouble doing. So we have an episode on this. It's our episode about dealing with non-stoic people, and we go in depth there. But basically, the Stoic argument, this is one that Epictetus talks about, is that your Stoics are totally okay to sympathize, which means meet somebody where they're at, talk to them in a language they understand. But a Stoic just needs to be careful about not empathizing. And when I say empathy, I just mean letting that person's anger become your anger, let their grief become your grief. So Epictetus's quote from the Enchiridion 16, or the Handbooks, chapter 16: when you see a person weeping in sorrow, either when their child goes abroad or when he is dead, so far as words, then, do not be unwilling to show him sympathy, and even if it happens so, to lament with him. But take care that you do not lament internally also. And so he's saying you can lament with them, you can get you can get upset with them, show that you see how much they're hurting, but don't also put that inside. Don't let that overcome you. And if that seems a bit selfish, like, well, I'll help you only insofar as it doesn't hurt me. I'll be a part of your cause only insofar as I don't have to be angry either. The Stoic argument would be, well, no, sometimes passions aren't good for you. They don't help you make good judgments. So people don't need passionate friends. They need in the Stoic sense of passionate. They don't need people overcome with harmful emotions. They need people of sound judgment. So the angry person doesn't need an angry friend. They need a calm friend. Is
Mhm.
the Stoic argument?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lecture by a 1950s philosopher named Ludwig Edelstein on
Oh,
Epictetus,
nice,
and he talks
nice
about,
name.
yeah, a very nice name, classic philosopher name. And then he talks about this very passage, and he uses a really powerful metaphor that I think is useful, which is that you need to enter the water to save a drowning person, right? You need to meet them, where they are, and that might mean communicating with them in a specific way, or that does mean communicating with them in a way that they're receptive to, that shows that you care about them, and doing this without while to the extent that you can, keeping that stoic distance between yourself and whatever the negative feeling or emotion is. But it's also worth remembering that the point is to save the drowning person, right? It's not to stop yourself from getting wet. That's a purpose of that. One of the main upshots of that analogy for me. So perhaps likewise, you could think when you're encountering some person who's suffering from negative emotions, the purpose, to the extent that you can, is to recognize whatever it is to fulfill your role in that situation, and perhaps not focus as much on Epictetus' advice about letting that negative emotion infiltrate you, as it were. um, I think that kind of advice can perhaps be misunderstood, and might be where some of the risk comes in for Stoics.
Well,
Does that make sense to you?
no, I think that's a great metaphor. I'm totally stealing that. I mean, because the metaphor here is just don't drown as well. When you're saving a drowning person, just be careful not to also drown. And that, I think where the metaphor starts to differ is that, is you getting upset, is you becoming passionate, is that drowning, or is that just you getting tired swimming in the water? As in, is it a harm that you take on to help somebody, or is it the worst thing? And I don't know. I don't know which way the Stoics would land on that. Maybe they say somewhere else. But I think your point is a valid one, which is that it's okay to take on some risk. It's okay to even be harmed sometimes in the attempt to help another person. Um, we want to be careful not to lament internally as well, but we're there to help the other person, and so if that means risking a bit of it, that's okay too.
Yeah, it's a nice extension of the metaphor. The thought that another point is, just as you shouldn't mind getting wet, you shouldn't. Of course, you need to save the person. You shouldn't drown. You need a certain level of skill to do that, to be able to pull it off.
Yeah. Great. And so those are the differences that I want to talk about. Any other comments on those differences?
So, if you're thinking about the takeaways from some of those initial examples, one of the main ones, one of the ways I try boil it down, is the Stoic is always trying to see what's true, and that involves seeing the negative aspects of reality along with the positive, negative aspects of people along with the positive. And it also requires that you focus on playing your role, whatever that means in a given situation. Uh, that's often going to look like not being the overbearing, positive person,
Mm-hmm.
not perhaps explaining tragedy in the way you would explain it to yourself, but explaining it to a way that the other person understands. Maybe not even explaining it at all, but just being there for the other person, and so on. It really comes down to some of these context specific type situations where you need to figure out, what's that other person like, what's my best action in this situation.
Yeah, I think that's well put. Which is to say that being a good person and being a good Stoic sometimes looks like not just explaining your internal position, but like being sensitive to the situation and saying, what do other people need here? What's my job here? How can I help the best? And if you start putting your own if you're a Stoic and you start being like, well, no, this is what I think you're being silly, I think you're being dumb because you're not being a Stoic. Well, then you could start kind of actually you can go too far, even though you're Stoic in one sense, but you're missing that important social aspect in another.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a kind of flexibility that's required, and I think one of my gripes with the term toxic positivity is that sometimes something that's described as toxic positivity might be good. You might want some cultures might just do better with
Yeah.
what's sometimes described as toxic
Well,
positivity,
it's
that
like,
focus on the optimism. But you also want to recognize, have the flexibility to be in other situations as well.
yeah, it's like coaching an athlete. Like you need to give them what they need. And if what they need is, blind optimism and if that's genuinely what's most helpful for them in the moment, there's a kind of flexibility there. Um, and that's that nuance to the role. I think that's a good point. Sometimes actually being, everything's going to be okay, everything's going to work out fine. Sometimes that is what a person needs to hear when you get into the messiness of things. Maybe not and unrealistic optimism is harmful in its inflexibility as well. And it's
Mm-hmm.
inflexibly positive. So you don't correct with it by being inflexibly negative or even realistic.
Right, right. Awesome.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, I mean, I think that was a good description. I think that, I mean, that clarified some things for me. But I wanted to close off here with that. There is a genuine risk for Stoics here, for people that are trying to be Stoics, of falling into whatever harm you want to call it, in some aspect, either being too optimistic or even being toxic towards other people and not fulfilling your roles. Um, and coming back to that craft metaphor, you suffer as a Stoic when you try to skip to the end result. You fall into this pattern when you try to skip to the end result. The Stoics pursue truth, and they have arguments for why only character is good and vice is bad, or good character is good and vice is bad, and why you shouldn't feel negative emotions. They have complex arguments for these, but this requires you to study. This requires you to internalize things. This requires you to be attentive to the nuances of situations. If you jump straight to the outcome, you try to act like a sage right away, you try to force yourself to become a Stoic immediately, you risk simplifying things into being black and white, uh, just good or bad. And that's not nuanced Stoicism. It's not the truth, right? And it's a simplified picture of the world, and it's harmful. It's like the person who learns the dichotomy of control and then immediately starts telling other people like, "Oh, just get over it. It's not up to you." Um, it's, you're onto something there, but you're simplifying things. It's not that easy to be a good Stoic, and so just be cautious about that. Recognize that it takes a long time. Something I work on, and I think if you do that, you'll get around a lot of these problems. And then if
Yeah.
somebody accuses of you of these things incorrectly, well, then you'll have to put up with it like anything
Welcome.
else.
Nah. Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Cool. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more Stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.